Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm seeing lots of folks come into this space. So happy to be here with all of you. I'm going to give that just another 30 seconds as we get the participants to load up. But thank you for joining us. I'm so excited to start book club this evening with our wonderful guest, Suzette. As folks are trickling in, I just want to tell folks that we are providing live closed captioning for this event. Please visit the link posted in the chat to view the closed captioning in another window or screen. We're also providing American Sign Language to translation. You can see that in the link that will be attached into the chat. And my name is Keosha Love. I'll be your host this evening. I'm a Toronto-based artist, activist, and educator. I'm very passionate about books and writing in general. And so it's my pleasure to be hosting Amnesty's launch of the book club this evening. We are the largest free book club in Canada with more than 11,000 members from across the country, and we're quickly growing every day. We have nearly 300 bookstore and library partners across Canada, including many school libraries and even a couple prison libraries, which is phenomenal. I know that we're all joining from different places. I'm joining from Toronto, the traditional ancestral territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I want to recognize that it is Black History Month and Black Futures Month. It's fitting that we have Suzette here to talk about this wonderful book. And as we celebrate, I think it's so important that we acknowledge the collective liberation between Indigenous and Black folks and the communal and collective liberation that we hold in the space as we have these conversations. Happy Black Futures Month to everyone who is celebrating. And again, I am so excited to be here and continue these conversations on protecting human rights. Again, as folks are coming in, I just want to share some house rules. If you're having any technical difficulties, please message our moderators in the Q&A and they'll try to help you out. We have a very large audience tonight. So wonderful that all of you can make it. And it's so great that Amnesty is providing this virtually so it's accessible to all of you wonderful folks. Please share your questions instead and use the Q&A feature in the Zoom because we have disabled the chat function in the Zoom just because of how many of us there are. We might not get to all of them, but still submit your questions anyways, and please be patient with us. Please be mindful that your messages should be respectful and consider that we do have a diverse audience tonight. Thanks to our Amnesty staff, Corey, Tawa, and Tara for helping us with the moderation, and thanks to our volunteers, Waleed, Kim, and Jasmine. We really couldn't do this without you. Some of the things we'll be talking about tonight might be a little bit triggering for some folks, so I would like to invite anyone who needs support from this event to reach out to Amnesty psychologists. Their contact information is on the screen, and we are offering 60 minutes of free counseling to anyone who attends if they need it. All right, I think that is most of us. And so we're going to get into it. And a little bit more about Amnesty is we're not our average book club. We're a community that reads together, learns together, and acts together. So if you'd like to learn more about how to take action for human rights during Black History and Futures Month, please visit our website, amnesty.ca/Black History Month. Before I introduce our guest, Suzette Mayr, I want to remind you to stay tuned until the very end of the evening because you don't want to miss your chance to win 10 signed copies of The Sleeping Car Porter, and we'll be randomly selecting 10 lucky winners at the end of this evening. So please hang tight. This next hour and a half is going to be full of beautiful dialogue and conversations. And don't forget, you can submit your questions in the Q&A bottom panel of the Zoom chat screen that you're looking at, and we'll get right into it. Before I introduce, I already said that. So as we introduce Suzette, she is a Canadian novelist and has written 5 critically acclaimed novels and won many awards, including the Scotiabank Giller Prize. She also works as a professor at the University of Calgary, Faculty of Arts, and join us from Calgary. Good evening, Suzette. How are you? Welcome to Amnesty's Book Club.
Good. It's such an honor to be here. Oh, I'm absolutely thrilled. Just wonderful.
Yeah, I know when I first found out that you would be the first person that we'd be talking to in conversation with for the relaunch, I was super excited because you do such phenomenal work. I haven't been to Calgary yet, but I plan to visit. Maybe we could be friends in real life and we could pay a visit to Calgary when I actually come there.
I would love that. I would love that.
So let's dive right into the book.
Sure.
Before I have all my burning questions for you, can you give us a brief introduction to your novel, The Sleeping Car Porter?
For sure. So the elevator pitch for the book is that it's set in 1929 and it revolves around a sleeping car porter named Baxter, who, like most porters of the time, is a Black man. Baxter is also a closeted gay man, and in the book, he's been hired to porter a Trans-Canada train line, which takes 88 hours and 45 minutes. But on this particular trip, and that's the trip from Montreal/Toronto to Vancouver, 88 hours and 45 minutes. And it's the fastest train on the continent. But on this particular trip, the train gets stuck in the Rocky Mountains for an additional 45 hours. And as a result of that, the passengers and the train workers, including the porters, get very restless. And the pressure cooker that is the small community on the train kind of explodes during those 45 hours trapped in the mountains. One thing to know about the book and about porters actually is that porters got very little sleep. They were on call for 24 hours, pretty much 24/7, except for maybe the 2 or 3 hours that they were able to get sleep, if they were able to get sleep. They were entitled to 4 hours, but very rarely were they able to get that full in quotation marks, full night's sleep. They also didn't get proper beds in berths. And this is prior to, labor rights being put into place. So this is, pre, at least in Canada, pre-1940s, pre-1920s in the United States. What else should I mention? Yeah, they usually had to sleep in smoking cars or smoking compartments, usually next to the toilets. And they were also expected to shine shoes on the job, and they worked. Tips constituted a huge portion of their payment. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that overview of the book. I found it really interesting to learn more about porters and the history of Black men on porters that, wasn't common knowledge for me personally. And it made me think what that was like to kind of imagine yourself as a Black man, as a porter, and what inspired you to write this book and inspired you to write it from that lens.
Yeah, so it's such an interesting story, and it's really interesting to me that you said that you weren't familiar with that history either, because I certainly wasn't. It was nothing that I learned in school. I didn't become aware of it until much, much later in my life. And so the genesis of this book, there were so many ways, so many things inspired this book, and I was reluctant to write it for a long time because I'm not a historical fiction writer, because I felt, especially at the beginning, that I did not know enough about sleeping car porter history. But basically, the reason I wrote this book was because it was a friend of mine who was a former creative writing instructor of mine named Fred Waugh, who's a former poet laureate of Canada, who was really formative for me as a teacher, as a creative writing teacher, because he was the first teacher who asked me or provoked me into writing about being a racialized person. It had never occurred to me before, but Fred has his own background as being part Chinese as well. And so he was into, and he's still into exploring this thing called hyphenated identity. Anyway, so Fred Waugh, suddenly out of the blue, I finished my degrees. I was a professional person, and Fred Waugh, out of the blue, just said to me, "Suzette, you have to write about the sleeping car porters." And I said, "Fred, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, what sleeping car porters?" And so this sat in my brain for a while, and so I started doing research, and I also asked Fred. I said, why, or what do sleeping car porters have to do with you? And he said that when he was younger, in the 1950s, I think it was, he was a Boy Scout on his way to a Scout jamboree. And part of that was him traveling with his group in a train. And there was a porter on the train. And the porter learned that my friend Fred, played the trumpet. And so one day the porter cracked out his trombone and started jamming with the kids. And this was a major moment for Fred. He talks about it as one of the most humanizing moments of being on a train. And so I started doing research into sleeping car porters, not having I had no idea what I would write about. And so a lot of this book was me just figuring out who they were, why they were important. Fantasy writers talk about world building. For me, it was also about world building. So what would it be like to be on a train, for 88 hours and 45 minutes. I'd ridden trains as a child before, but certainly not for that long. At that point, I don't remember there being porters. I'm sure there were, which said something about me, I'm sure. And as I did the research, I started to understand, how incredibly important they were in terms of Black history, So people like Stanley Grizel working, and the kind of activist work he and other porters, and also the communities around the porters did in advancing Black labor rights, in I think developing, a respect for Black people, a Black middle class. So, people like Calvin Ruck, who became a senator, Rufus Rockhead, who opened up a nightclub in Montreal and helped with the cultural landscape in that city. So, and they also, had huge effects on culture and all kinds of things in Canada because, for example, Oscar Peterson, the famous jazz pianist, and his sister Daisy, who was also an accomplished pianist, their father was a porter who strongly encouraged, little Oscar to work on his piano, and he became the legend that he is. And so, there was that history. And I found often that when I would talk about the fact that I was working on this book, people would talk about, the formation of the Brotherhood and the unionizing, et cetera, et cetera. But I was far more interested in what led to that kind of labor action. So I've always been a sucker for the 1920s. I love the literature from that time, from the Harlem Renaissance, but also writers like Virginia Woolf and Gertrude Stein, writers like that. They were doing such innovative, remarkable work. Zora Neale Hurston. And so I knew I wanted the book to be set in the 1920s. I knew I wanted it to be set primarily in Canada. And once I figured out, okay, I want to write about sleeping car porters, it became more of a quest for, well, who though? Which sleeping car porter? What individual am I going to center this story on? So that's a very long answer. I could spend the entire hour and a half talking about how I came to write this book. So
But that's exactly why you're here. And I
yeah,
could listen
that's
to you for hours. And I think it's so fascinating that a friend of yours gave you that nudge to do this research. And I find it also fascinating that it was something that you had no prior knowledge to.
yeah.
And my question is, like, what were some of the surprises that came out of doing this research?
What were some of the surprises? There were so many.
I can imagine.
Yeah, I think one of the things that hit me from the very beginning was just the conditions within which these men worked. The fact that they weren't allowed, basically, they weren't allowed to sleep, I found just unbelievable. The precariousness of the work. So if they, you could get fired, well, there's a demerit system where you would collect demerits for anything that you did wrong. And if you got too many demerits, you would automatically lose your job. And the demerits system was not fair. Like literally people, I heard about somebody who got fired for spilling a cup of coffee on someone by accident, and it wasn't even his fault. Somebody stepped on some upholstery while making up a berth, like just the precariousness was unbelievable, and just so unfair given the conditions of the job. What I was also really surprised about was the community of men, and how difficult for me it was to kind of penetrate that cone of silence that surrounded the job. It struck me, over and over again as I was trying to do research into these men, that they were kind of cagey individuals. They wanted to present a particular facade because it was all about, maintaining that aura of being professional men, of being extremely competent men, of having each other's backs. And I think also protecting their families so that their families wouldn't be aware of the the daily humiliations and the challenges of the job. But at the same time, there was so much going on beneath the surface, in terms of their interactions with each other, the creation of things like the brotherhood, but also the small kinds of rivalries, there's just the day-to-day, just trying to figure out the day-to-day of this incredibly strange job was hugely surprising to me. And then the other element, was just trying to, I suppose, put myself in that world and understand the day-to-day and the minutia of that world. And so I remember specifically, just trying to find out, what kinds of amenities would a working class person in Winnipeg, for example, have, in their home? Where would they live? Would there be running water? Would they have electricity in their homes? This, just what would the wallpaper look like? Those kinds of details. And the way, and because those kinds of details aren't recorded in any kind of official way, I had to dig and dig and dig. And I'll never forget, being in the Winnipeg archives and talking to the archivists there and saying, I'd like to just find a picture of the interior of a working class home. Like, how do I do that? And the archivist said, wait here. And the archivist came back with a series of photos, with a file. It was a file where you had to get permission to look at this file. And in it was a series of photos of the interiors of people's homes. So there's the light bulb hanging from the ceiling. Oh, there's a sink with cold water, a cold water faucet. There's the wallpaper, et cetera, et cetera. There are pots hanging from the wall, but there's the dead body in the foreground, because the only time you would get photographs of the interiors of people's homes, regular people, was if they were crime scene photos. So those kinds of archival discoveries were completely, I could not have planned for that. And the same went for trying to uncover queer history in Canada, because, I've said this over and over again, that queer people throughout history, for protection, have had to hide. And so as a result, you're not going to find a lot about them in the archives to a certain point. And there's also sort of like the straight washing of archives that sometimes happen. And I'll never forget being, I think it was once again in Winnipeg, or perhaps it was in Montreal, where, I went to an archive and I learned about a box of transcribed interviews with queer men, with gay men from, I think the 1930s, maybe 1940s. And, I put in a request to get this box of interviews, and I thought, this is great. I'm going to learn all kinds of things about queer culture, queer male culture, from, the first half of the 20th century in Canada. And the archivist brought the box, and I opened the box and it was empty. And I said to the archivist, I said, there's nothing in here. And the archivist said, well, yes, it's, either the people, either the men who were interviewed or their families don't want that information released, And so it was devastating to me that even then, and this was in the 2000s, mid 2000s, even then people were too scared to come out. And it just sort of lit the fire under me even more to, I have to write this book. I've got to find my ancestors. I've got to find my family, my queer family. Yeah.
Wow. It seems like there was a lot of erasure. And so there was so much erasure. And so it was shocking to see how much of that erasure then gets brought to the light, and how much resources and tools and conversations that just weren't taught in our schools then gets brought to our attention, and how much that then kind of alters our entire reality, which I feels like it did for you and your understanding of this significant part of Black history. And we have a lot of folks who have some questions about that research as well, specifically around sleep. We have a question from Nancy who asks, what research did you explore in order to lead to this vivid depiction of the state of sleep deprivation? And I find that such a wonderful question, because you spoke to like the emotion and trying to put yourself in their shoes of what it was like to be a porter, and kind of that day to day. And so what was that like to kind of uncover sleep deprivation?
Sleep deprivation. So I did old-fashioned research, which was I looked at peer-reviewed articles, sleep studies. which, because I knew that when people are chronically sleep deprived, or, if you haven't had sleep for a long time, their hallucinations are going to be a result of that. It's going to be a manifestation, in addition to all kinds of other symptoms like personality changes, et cetera, et cetera. And so I looked into those articles, and, just like with the history books, articles like that are great for giving like a broad brushstroke understanding, but not the minutia that I needed in order to make the world in the book fully immersive for the reader. And, I tried the experiment of staying up one night really late. I went to a horror movie marathon festival, where it was like whatever, 12 hours of horror movies, but it was ridiculous. And I realized that, by about 3 o'clock, I'm going to crash. And this is not what the Porters would have gone through in any way, shape, or form. But I did remember during those moments that my mother was, before she retired, she was an oncology nurse, and she used to work night shifts all the time. And so I started thinking back to when I was younger and when she would be doing her night shifts, and just the difficulty of transitioning into night shift because it's not as if you're sleeping 8 hours at night, you're awake during the day, and then all you have to do in order to switch into night shift is just, okay, I'll just sleep 8 hours during the day and then be awake. It doesn't work like that. It certainly didn't for her. She had to do a gradual transitioning. She also had 3 kids running around the house. So she'd be lucky if she got 3 hours of sleep the first night, maybe 5 hours of sleep the second night, it just on and on. And in addition to that, what would also happen was that her personality would change, so she became a lot more sensitive. She had mood changes. She was perpetually exhausted. And I'll never forget, there was one time when I went to go pick her up from the hospital after a 12-hour shift. I think it was 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock in the morning. And we're driving, and it's a beautiful sunny day, and a bumblebee crashed into the windshield. And she had a total meltdown. And it was completely, I think that's really tragic when a bumblebee dies as well, but it was this completely outsized reaction to a small thing. I mean, I think she'd also come off, she worked in oncology, so I can only imagine what she saw on a nightly basis. But that just kind of, that the mood changes, the outsized reaction to things, the need to sleep, the perpetual need to sleep. And so when I was working on the book, I knew that throughout the book, it's called The Sleeping Car Porter, which is a play on the sleeping car, but also the sleeping car porter. And I knew that sleep would be a major theme, a major motif running throughout the book. So it was all about, for me, trying to figure out, okay, how do I depict sleeplessness? How do I depict sleep and an accumulation of sleeplessness without putting the reader to sleep and or without being repetitive? And so, that was it was one of the big challenges for sure, because I couldn't just have the character yawning all the time. There's so much more to it than that, right? Those kind of micro sleeps that your body kind of forces on you, that the kind of lack of ability to focus, so it was just a lot of research and observation. Yeah.
And you could see that throughout the book. There was a very clear attention to the anxiousness and to the restlessness that was throughout the pages. And I could feel my body kind of feeling those emotions and feeling that as we travel through the book. And I thought that was really well depicted. I just want to remind folks in the audience that we still have our psychotherapist available if folks need extra care. And I want to go to another question that we have from someone in the audience.
Sure.
They said, I wondered whether Baxter's lack of sleep on the train influenced the story. Were there any of the scenes on the train a figment of his imagination?
Ooh. Okay. So were any of the scenes a figment of his imagination? I don't know I don't know how to answer that, because I think what I really want to do, and my whole attitude around writing a book, is I write it and then I give it to the world, and then people can read it any way they want. And so I think, as readers, you have a couple of options, which is that you you could, and I've had people talk to me about the book, and some of the readings have been really super interesting, where okay, so I'll backtrack. So you could read the book as though, this is just the result of him being sleepy and all of it's true. Or you could read the book as, there are elements of it that are not true, but are a result of his sleeplessness. I had one reader say to me that they thought that the character Esme, the little girl who clings to him throughout the book, that Esme doesn't actually exist, that she is sort of symbolic and a result of, like, she's a hallucination. People have asked about the crawling man. I kind of want to leave it. I want to leave it. I want to leave that hesitation there in terms of interpretation. So I think if you want to read it as just sleep hallucination, you can. If you want to read it as partially supernatural, you can. And if you want to read it as totally 100% real, then you can as well. And hopefully, all of those readings work. So that's me not answering that question. Because I want the book to be, for readers, I want it to be theirs, right? Yeah.
I think that's actually a very fair and reasonable answer. And I think there is a lot of room for us to kind of imagine what it would have been like for us, right? Whether that would have been a hallucination, whether that it's real. I think that creates, like you said, our own world and our own possibility of what that could have been like for Baxter. And so I respect your answer on that. um, there was a lot of folks calling, well, the passengers calling him George.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you more about that and the significance of George.
Yes. Okay. So I've got my papers next to me because I'm so bad at remembering dates. But basically where George comes from is, it's an insult. It's a terrible insult. And it comes from George Pullman and George Pullman's role in developing the luxury sleeping car. So so George Pullman invented the sleeping car. The whole notion of the sleeping car in in collaboration with somebody else. And Pullman sleeping cars, I'm sorry, I'm just looking at my notes so I don't get it wrong. Pullman sleeper cars were first used in the US in 1865 and introduced in Canada in the 1870s. And the cars were, unlike train travel prior, the cars were extremely comfortable. Train travel prior to that was not comfortable. And so the idea of having, beds, having it be luxurious and actually getting a good night's sleep was this novel concept and being served. Part of that, sadly, was the whole idea of bringing in, sort of the idea of the Old South and the nostalgia associated with the Old South, which was to have Black servants, right? And so that's why the porters were all Black men, in order to continue that whole kind of plantation fantasy by having these Black servants. And part of the tradition of, enslavement, at least in the US, part of the, in North America, let's just be frank here, part of the tradition of enslavement is that, enslaved people were given the names of their owners. And so the whole idea of these porters being called George was because they were being named after George Pullman. And they were also, to call a porter George was hugely insulting. To call, sometimes they were called boy. There were quite a few kind of memoirs that I found where, the titles were, there were titles like, my name's not George, or don't call me George, hey George, because this was, it was hugely symbolic of a fundamental disrespect for the men. Yeah.
Thank you for answering that. I actually did not know about the significance or the harm behind George. And I had a feeling as I was reading that there's something here. And so I'm so glad I got that clarity from you. And I think the character itself is complex in its fact that it's both a Black person in a service role and then also a queer person trying to figure things out and kind of suppress that piece of him. Why was it important for you to include these intersections? And you kind of mentioned in the beginning, at first it was like, okay, these porters are a part of Black history, but what does it now look like for it to be queer history and the erasure that comes with queer history. What was that process of including that queer identity? And was it something you always knew you wanted to start with, or did it eventually come later?
Oh, it came later. It came way late. Uh, I knew, as a Black person in Canada, I wanted to know more about Black Canadian history. I wanted to know specifically Black Canadian history in the prairies where I was born, in Alberta, and our presence here. And, I've talked to people from here, Black people from here, and the narrative were kind of given over and over again, at least up until, like certainly when I was growing up in the 70s, early 80s, was that you are the only one. There's you and your family, and then maybe one other kid, but otherwise you're the only one, which is ridiculous given how many of us there are. But the history was just not there. And I credit people like Cheryl Fogo, who's a playwright, filmmaker, novelist, historian, who lives here, who's worked really hard to talk about, to make, to disseminate information, and to make people understand the history of like the presence of Black people in the prairies, like people like John Ware, the Black cowboy, people like that. So it's interesting that when I first started the book, or when Fred first proposed it to me, when Fred Wass said, you have to write this book about the sleeping car porters, for a long time, I thought, well, what does this have to do with me growing up in the prairies? I thought that probably all sleeping car porters were men who came from those larger communities, like in Little Burgundy in Montreal, like in Toronto, in Vancouver, or Nova Scotia, Africville. I thought it was probably the porters would have come from those groups. So, and for me as a writer, I have to feel some sort of personal connection to what I'm writing about if I'm going to see a project through to the very end. Because writing a novel, you have to be, for me at least, I have to be really engaged and passionate about that topic, because it's going to take years to write that book, because it's going to take hundreds of pages. And so for a few years, it was difficult to get involved with this book, because I thought it doesn't, this is about Black people, but it has nothing to do with my Black people. And by my Black people, I mean, my mother being part of that wave of people from the Caribbean who immigrated in the 1960s. And but as I was doing the research, I came across, it was Sage Matthew, or Sarah Jane Matthew, who's a historian who specializes in sleeping car porter history, who I came across an article of hers. So my mother's from the Bahamas, originally from the 60s. And or she came up in the 60s. And I was reading this book by Sarah Jane Matthew, and in it, she mentions that, it's just a single tiny little line, that sleeping car porters were actively recruited by railway companies from the Bahamas in the early 1900s. And so it was suddenly this moment of, wait a second, maybe I do have more of a connection to this than I initially thought. And then I also interviewed Sarah Jane, because I said, I'm thinking it's the 1920s. Maybe this will be a prohibition story. Al Capone supposedly was hanging out in Winnipeg in the 1920s, and I could make this a Al Capone mafia story set in Winnipeg. And Sarah Jane told me that was completely boring, and don't do it, because that story has been done. And so I thought, okay, what do I do now? And she said to me, what about a porter who's from Alabama, who sees the Rocky Mountains for the very first time? And that was a beautiful moment, because I live in Calgary and I'm so close to the Rocky Mountains. If I climb a hill that's tall enough, I can see the Rocky Mountains. The story started becoming closer and closer to me. So it's like, well, maybe my sleeping car porter's from the Bahamas. Maybe the some of the action in this book can take place in the Rocky Mountains. So I don't have to, not only did I have to do the time traveling to the 20s and also, body traveling into the body of a man, but, what was getting to me was, oh, and I have to know Montreal intimately, or I have to know Vancouver or Winnipeg intimately, and I can't do it. But suddenly it was like, well, no, this is the Bahamas. It could be the Rockies. This can be about Bahamian people, in Canada in the 1920s. And so for a long time, I had this porter. His name was Ted W. in early drafts, and he was a straight man. And I thought, okay, well, where's the drama? And I had heard from a couple of sources or read that some of the porters, there were every so often there were porters who were bigamists, who had families on both sides of the line, and that was partly, I don't know, partly desire, but also sometimes it had to do with racism, where they might have been from the US and their American family couldn't come up to Canada for whatever reason. And so they had this American family and then they had a Canadian family, So I thought, okay, well, then I'll do that, maybe as twins over here and whatever. And, and it was still just not resonating for me. And until I thought, well, okay, maybe he has a male lover in Winnipeg. And then I thought, okay, I'm a queer person. That's actually interesting for me. Not that that other story isn't interesting, but it's not connecting with me. And then as I started to write about the male lover in Winnipeg, I realized that's my story. And so the straight family narrative, that just sort of dropped away. And so I had this closeted man working on the trains. And it was, I'll just confess, it was my own personal desire to see people like me in Canada and to see our history in Canada. When I knew as a researcher, as a writer, that it was highly unlikely I would ever be able to find that kind of history in any sort of archive, in any sort of history book, I knew that I would have to, just do my due diligence, do all that historical research, and then do what Saidiya Hartman calls critical fabulation, which is, if you can't find evidence of who it, of what it is you want to find, you can do all of your historical research, and then you as the fiction writer, you can connect the dots. And so Baxter is me connecting all of those dots, of Black people in Canada, queer people in Canada, the gaps in the archives, criminal records, of porters I found. There was a porter I found who was arrested for gross indecency in Toronto with a janitor I think it was in the early 1900s in a railway hotel. Who's this man? Me just trying to put it all together. And I don't know who said it, but reconstituting that dandelion of my ancestors, Black and queer.
I think that's so beautiful and honest, right? Our desire for connection in any kind of artwork that we're trying to produce, any body of work that we want to produce, there's always going to be this desire to connect with our characters.
Mhm.
And I understand that you also have a passage that you wanted to read about Baxter. Can you read that for us?
For sure. Okay, so this is a George passage. So it's a passage where he's been called George, but it also gives a sense of his interiority while working on the train and being discriminated against the way he is being discriminated against. And it starts out, just to give you a bit of context. So the conductor of the train has been nicknamed by the porters. He's been nicknamed Mad Mary Magruder. So Mad Mary Magruder makes a cameo in this. And this is from earlier on in the book. Mad Mary Magruder calls, "All aboard!" The oar drawn out until it sounds almost mournful. Baxter tucks away the step box and heaves the trap, then the door closed. The train judders, then sighs. Baxter stands alone in the steel burgundy bubble of the vestibule, swaying with the train as it rumbles out of the station. He inhales a deep breath. He kicks the metal wall hard. He bends down to polish the toe of his shoe with his thumb, flourishes a green duster out of his pocket to polish the He flourishes a green duster out of his pocket to polish the scuff off the painted, riveted wall. 88 hours and 45 minutes to go. The floor darkens and drops away, then rises up, gurgling with light. He can feel vomit rising up into his throat, but he covers his mouth, closes his eyes until his nausea passes, until the waves of sleepiness hitting him recede with the tide. The floor settles flat, settles solid and hard again beneath his feet. He yanks at the bottom button of his coat. He straightens his jacket, resets his cap on his head, then strides into the passageway. He changes from his blue uniform coat into the white summer uniform coat. He saunters past the ladies' washroom and into the tube of shelf after shelf of passengers while the train speeds and sparks over the rails in the dark. The passengers continue to bustle themselves into the rows of smooth beds he's prepared that bloom from the ceiling and every wall, the aisle of drapes shrouding the beds in the sections. The passengers settle into their soft mattressed shelves with their suitcases and boxes, their hats, their nightshirts and dressing gowns, their unsolicited opinions and their bottomless pits of well-to-do and phony well-to-do needs. Porter, asks one, you must wake me at the correct time. The porter on the train from Chicago forgot. Remember, Willie? That porter wasn't right in the head, if you ask me. Porter, asks another, fetch me a new pillow. This one's sticking me with feathers. Oh, Porter, asks yet another one, are we going to be on time? What time will we get to Moosomin? George, asked one, how far away to the club car? I need a drink. Click, thinks Baxter. He is a clicking robot created to serve. He is a whirring automaton screwed together to entertain. He runs last-minute errands as they settle into sleep. He shifts the ladder up and down the aisle as passengers ascend and descend for water for the washroom, 2 passengers snoring already. The passengers' unshined shoes and boots wash up along the shores of the curtains, drop into place behind the small metal doors along the passageway of compartments and the drawing room. The passengers whisper and slide into sleep, rustling, snoring, and sleep-talking in their neat curtained rows or behind their deluxe mahogany doors. In 88 hours and 5 minutes, he will land on the other side of the country. This run west as long as a Portuguese man-of-war tentacle, long and painful. He blends into the flocked wallpaper, just another shadow ambling down the hallway of drawn berth curtains, and he gathers 2 pairs of boots or shoes at a time, just like it says in the instruction book, even though it's inefficient as the devil. He scrawls the section numbers with soap on the soles. In the smoker, he settles himself in the green leather chair and shines shoes. He isn't obliged to shine shoes, but the company expects him to shine shoes. Shining shoes means tips and no complaints and keeping his job. Not shining shoes means becoming that fired porter James, a free man with severely diminished prospects, working as a chimney sweep in Calgary, last Baxter heard. Baxter burrows into the still warm shoes, brushing, rubbing, the repetition of shoe after boot, a sick, slick rhythm. The bell rings. He springs up, wiping boot black off his hands. So that's
Thank you.
that section.
Thank you so much for reading that section with us. You could really tell the exhausting repetition of being on this train, the exhausting repetition of the work and the labor that's being done. And while you read, I just felt myself wishing we'd get off that train. Wishing we'd get off that train. What was it like trying to make this train a character in the book? Because it feels like we get to know and familiarize ourselves with the train, what's on the train, what's happening on the train, the sounds and sights of the train. Can you please share what the train represents to you and maybe what your favorite part of the book you like describing the train?
Yeah. So what the train represents to me. I mean, the train is, for the men in the book, it's a major symbol of repression and oppression. You know, for so many Black men of the time, it was pretty much the only good paying job you could get in Canada. In the US, it was a bit different. And I know that even in Canada, there's more and more research coming out of Black people working at different jobs. But the railway, I mean, that was the job that employed the majority of Black people in Canada. But at the same time, you know, I read over and over and over again just what an education the men who rode these trains got as a result of riding the trains. You know, the travel that they did, the dissemination of all kinds of really interesting information and cultural products. So there's the story of, you know, how jazz from the South, that hold the music that we understand as jazz, was disseminated partly because of porters bringing that music up from the South and, you know, coming up to the North, and etc. There's also stories of porters taking newspapers or magazines from the train, you know, collecting them from you know, passengers, and wrapping them up and tying them with a string and throwing them out the windows to their own communities. You know, so it reminded me a little bit, just talking with a few people, of maybe being a sailor, you know, where you're kind of traveling from port to port to port to port. And on one hand, the job is really hard. On the other hand, it's like, if you're a young person, you know, wanting to strike out on your own, if you're a lone wolf like Baxter, you know, there's all kinds of opportunity that's presented by that kind of travel and meeting different kinds of people and making money. The other element that I thought was super interesting was, I was talking with a good friend of mine, and I was saying to him, you know, in terms of romantic liaisons on trains, you know, what do you think about that? Do you think that's realistic? And he said, I mean, well, think about it. It's just you know, a whole line of bedrooms. It's one big bedroom on wheels. So of course there's going to be that kind of sexual frisson and romantic element there. You know, so the train is this claustrophobic, limited, oppressive space. But at the same time, I think there's also all kinds of potential in it, in terms of the kind of people you meet, what you learn about human nature. I read this wonderful article written in the 1920s by a former porter who became a psychologist, writing about the psychology of porters on trains and the psychology of passengers on trains. And you know, this basically what amounted to, from what I could tell, was a 1920s version of what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, except that it's on the train. I know, though, like, part of my research was to you know, I rode the train with my partner from Winnipeg to Vancouver, just to get a sense of what it might have been like. I mean, I remember riding it as a child, but I needed to know what it was like, you know, as an adult. And the train was indeed, you know, very luxurious and lovely, but it was also, as the time went on, it became more and more claustrophobic, because really you're in this very limited space. You couldn't really stretch in any way, shape, or form, because you'd hit somebody. And you saw the same people over and over and over again. So it became this kind of very small village, you know, that by the end of it, I was glad to get off the train. It was lovely. I loved the food. I loved everything about it. I loved the landscape, but it was, after a while, it's too much. It was too much. So I'm going to just read it, if it's okay. I'm going to read a short passage, which is my favorite train scene. And the reason it's my favorite is, it's a little bit selfish, but it took so much darn research to be able to write this scene. And so I look at it and I think, oh, you know, good for you, Suzette, for managing to figure all this stuff out. But this revolves around, so Baxter is in love with a former porter instructor named Edwin Drew. And so this deals with Edwin Drew. Flinging along metal tracks in his luxurious prison somewhere between Medicine Hat and Calgary, Baxter thinks about Edwin Drew. Mr. Drew in his finely cleaned and pressed monkey suit, sailing around like a king of England with his precise pronunciation, his brain a full set of Encyclopedia Britannica, as he showed the new porters all stuffed into the off-duty car how to make down and make up a berth, how to fold a blanket exactly by drawing the blanket from the foot to the head, how to shake the curtain to quietly wake up a passenger who has to detrain in the night, how to use the whisk broom on a male passenger's jacket, an ostrich feather duster for cobwebs, how to sponge then dry off a washstand without leaving smears or blots or cloudy patches, the code names for mice, otherwise known as diamonds, and rats, otherwise known as sapphires, roaches, otherwise known as rubies, and bedbugs, codename pearls in a car. How to deal with ladies having lady issues, how to deal with men having men issues, how to deal with drunk passengers, make them drunker, declared Mr. Drew, and he winked at Baxter while all the student porters laughed. How to deal with passengers who'd had too much to drink the night before, how to deal with a disorderly woman or sporting girl plying her wares on the train, how to calm down the sleep talkers, the sleepwalkers, how to know the time it takes for a train to travel from Chicago to Smith Falls or from Duluth to Sault Ste. Marie, the infinite number of protocol crimes that could earn demerits, such as disloyalty, dishonesty, the use of intoxicating liquors or frequenting of places where they are sold, immorality, insubordination, incompetence, gross carelessness, untruthfulness. The infinite crimes that could earn dismissal, such as disloyalty, dishonesty, the use of intoxicating liquors or frequenting of places where they are sold, immorality, insubordination, incompetence, gross carelessness, untruthfulness. How to look in the little instruction handbook with its cardboard covers they all have to carry if they have any questions about the rules. Mr. Drew had a wide, clear face, sported wide shoulders, and Baxter wondered if he engaged in calisthenics. But when Baxter took a turn to show how he knew how to make up a berth, he had to shove the lower mattress into the upper berth and shove the berth back into place with all his might, sweat pouring down the sides of his head, his eyeglasses sliding down his nose, skating down the nervous moisture. He suddenly understood why Mr. Drew's shoulders and arms wielded so much power, how he swirled and folded sheets like a bullfighter, and snapped up and snapped down the ponderous, heavy berths from the ceiling as though they were made of cloud. At the end of the final day of portering lessons at Union Station in Toronto, the other junior porters walked away along the siding, away from the car, in a bedraggled, hopeful group. Baxter lingered as Edwin Drew packed up his shoeshine kit, bedding. As he expertly folded sheets from an earlier demonstration, Edwin Drew told a story about one time when a passenger asked him to fetch a packet of cigarettes from a station, and before he knew it, the train was pulling away and he wasn't on it. Baxter folded pillow slips. Edwin Drew laughed lustily as he told the story, his laugh pounding and rich. Baxter tried to laugh too, just the two of them left in the car as Edwin Drew cleared up. "Never ran so fast in my life," Edwin Drew said. He pinched the bridge of his nose as he finished laughing, his teeth perfectly symmetrical, perfectly in order. Baxter smiled and polished his eyeglasses with a handkerchief. Edwin Drew turned down the light and stood in the vestibule doorway, ready to leave. Baxter followed, but stopped short just behind Edwin Drew because Edwin Drew wasn't exiting the car. "Do you want to have a little fun?" whispered Edwin Drew. He brushed a speck of something off Baxter's shoulder. "Like what?" asked Baxter. Edwin Drew tugged at Baxter's lapels as though to straighten them, then kissed him. Baxter's very first kiss. The kiss astonished him, like he'd been pushed off a cliff and discovered he could fly. Edwin Drew broke down a berth faster than Baxter had seen in all those 2 weeks. I'll stop there. So part of the reason I really enjoy that part is because it's all about their budding love affair between Baxter and Edwin Drew, that is. And also, it was such a lovely moment for me in the archives to find that instruction booklet. I found an instruction booklet, and to see the code names for the vermin and the rodents, the pearls, the roaches, the rubies, the diamonds. It was just this, it was suddenly kind of cracked open a realization for me that this was there's a whole other language, there's a whole other code to being on these trains and surviving on these trains. Yeah.
I thought the code was really fascinating, just the juxtaposition between like vermin and bugs and these precious stones. I thought that was really interesting, and I love that you added that in. And you also, in that particular passage, you see a little bit of the softness of the budding core love that you aren't seeing in the world of the train. It's not soft, it's very much the opposite.
Yeah.
So in that moment, we get to see the softness of like this kiss and this romance, which I thought was really beautiful. Before I ask you another question, I just want to remind folks that if you want to ask Suzette any questions, please put them in the Q&A box instead of raising your hand. That way we could see them. And then that goes to my next question. We talked a lot before the passage about the duality and the nuances of the train, right? The fact that it's heavy, it is hardworking, the opposite of soft, but I really thought it was interesting that you then said, but it was a chance to have worldly experiences. You were well-traveled, well-read. You were able to be a part of different class and different conversations. You were exposed to things that you might have not been exposed to in different careers, right? But you still have this fixation on higher hopes and higher dreams from the porters themselves, even though they were getting exposed to all the things that you said around class and conversation and travel and all these different cities. Can you tell us more about the fixation of being a dentist that we see so much through Baxter, and your choice of language to include the dentistry in there?
Yes. So the dentist and Baxter's wanting to be a dentist. I knew that Baxter needed a way out of this job, that he needed some sort of goal, whether it was achievable or not. He needed some way of envisioning some kind of freedom for himself. And so I knew he needed to have some sort of job, but I wasn't sure what kind of job. And as I was writing, and I can't remember when I exactly hit upon this, but I remember thinking that, for the porters, the passengers are all texts. They're texts that have to be read if you want to keep your job, if you want to get a good tip, right? So being able to read a passenger, what they wear, how they behave. There are apocryphal stories of the soles of their shoes. You could tell, if somebody was actually wealthy based on the soles of their shoes or whatever. And being able to anticipate a passenger's needs before they did would guarantee, you not losing your job and or you getting higher tips. And so I thought, another way that Baxter could read passengers would be by reading the insides of them. So basically looking inside their mouths and seeing, what's going on in their mouths, smelling their breath, because, a certain quality of bad breath can mean that there's actually illness. People who grind their teeth or have anxiety and grind their teeth, there's a certain look to those teeth. You can tell class from the condition of people's teeth. You can, I remember talking to Cheryl Fogo, who I spoke about earlier, the historian here, filmmaker, who said that, she was a dental assistant. And I asked her, I asked her, when you were a dental assistant, what was your favorite mouth? And she said that her favorite mouth was this mouth where when the person bit down, there was a perfectly round kind of opening. And it was because that person had sucked their thumb for way too long. And so their teeth grew around the thumb in their mouths. And I thought, that is so interesting. It's interesting visually, but it's also interesting in terms of, okay, why did that person suck their thumb for so long? what was going on emotionally, what was going on psychologically. And so, and Baxter being able to look inside of people and see, you sucked your thumb for a really long time. What does that mean? Would give him, an added edge, I suppose. It's also an act of subversion to, have somebody yelling at you and being able to disconnect from that and concentrate instead, rather than concentrating on the words and the danger associated with the words, but instead concentrate on the condition of this person's teeth and be able to understand them that way.
Yeah, I find that also fascinating. And I agree with you, especially the visual aspect of seeing people's mouths and their teeth and kind of what kind of backstory that might come with. I find that all really interesting. But I also find interesting too, Baxter's really fascinated and excited and is willing to become a dentist. And was there any consideration, whether for you or do you think Baxter as a character considered what it would mean to actually become a dentist and whether he would then have access to certain liberties he didn't have access before? Or do you think there was a maybe unaddressed reality that he would still have to face certain barriers?
So is your question about would he actually at some point achieve a certain kind of freedom and independence as
Yeah,
a dentist?
what would symbolically Baxter actually attain by being the dentist? And is that something that not only you as an author kind of already have at the back of mind as you reflect and wrote the book, but do you think Baxter was aware of what he would or would not actually attain as a dentist, being a Black queer person?
I don't I don't know. I don't know, even though I wrote the character, I don't know if he maybe even thought about it that far,
Mhm.
honestly, because it's all about getting into people's mouths, rather than thinking about what that could actually mean. Um, that is such a good question. That's a remarkable question. I've never been asked that before. Um, I mean, one, you know, in all of the research I've done as far as queer lives in history, one thing I have noticed is that people who have a lot of money can get away with a lot more than people who don't have money. They can buy privacy, they can buy exclusivity, they can not necessarily buy acceptance, but and I suppose what I was thinking when I picked dentistry was that he would have more money and enough money to live his life a little bit more freely. Um, I, if I think about, if there were a sequel to this book, I don't think there will be, but if there were a sequel to this book, I like one of Baxter's dreams is to create invent something that will help with prosthetic teeth, that will help with dentures. And so, would he make enough money to become, independently wealthy with his invention? Um, that's such a good question. I don't think I can answer that question.
And that's okay because
Yeah,
that's where being a writer comes from, right? Having still some gaps and having to fill them along the way as you create new stories.
yeah,
But the entire Amnesty team really thought about that question and really reflected on this idea of truly being free once you've achieved a certain kind of class and certain kind of occupation, but what that actually means for Baxter as a queer
yeah,
person. And that could go into even bigger conversation in the Black community as a whole about wealth actually
yeah,
being liberation and whether those two things can coexist, and whether wealth is just wealth and doesn't actually do anything.
yeah,
So
yeah,
many deeper conversations, but I do want to talk about the labor rights movement because ultimately Baxter wants to get out because he's exhausted. Regardless of where the dentist career takes him, there's an urgency to leave the space, to leave the train.
yeah,
Um, and it's a clear reflection of how much Black men were overworked and just undervalued. And my question is, what do you think the lasting impact did the unions who tried to improve working conditions and wages for Black sleeping car porters, what do you think the lasting impact did for those unions as they created for Canadians?
What was the lasting impact? Okay, I'm going to read from my paperwork because I thought about that, and it's so interesting. I mean, so okay, so what's this source? I went to the Canadian Encyclopedia and looked at sleeping car porters in Canada because I was trying to figure out, how to talk about labor. And I think, just to go back to your earlier question about dentistry, I think part of my inability to answer that question is because I don't think it would make a difference. I mean, that's the sad thing, him becoming a dentist, and I don't know if he would ever actually be, I mean, he can't buy his way out of the circumstances that are associated or the results of racism and homophobia. I don't think he could do it. You can make your own little pocket, but yeah, anyway, so maybe I was just too sad to answer that question. Anyway, okay. So I'm just going to read, this is my history lesson, and I've got paper with me just because I didn't want to forget anything. So basically, by 1939, or rather in August 1925, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was established by Black railway workers in the United States. By 1939, Canadian porters were given membership in the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in American Union because they could not get, rights came to Canadian porters much later than in the US. The Canadian chapter worked alongside its American counterpart to fight against racism and the various challenges that Black porters faced on the job. Over the next few years, porters across Canada organized in secret so that they wouldn't lose their jobs. In 1942, Canadian porters formed BSCP divisions in Montreal, Toronto, and Winnipeg, and later in Calgary, Edmonton, and Vancouver. Porters voted to unionize. However, a collective bargaining agreement was not signed with the CPR until May 1945. So in the US, it was 25. In Canada, it was 1945. And as a result of that, they got monthly salary increases, vacation, overtime pay, et cetera, and also the right to put plaques up in the cars stating their names so that they wouldn't get the George thing. Okay, now in terms of the legacy, beginning in the 1960s, changes in the travel, and they also were able to be promoted to the role of conductor or whatever, which they weren't able to before. Beginning in the 1960s, changes in the travel industry caused railways to employ fewer sleeping car porters. However, the impact that the BSCP made within Canadian history is profound. At a time when Black people were fighting for their basic human rights, the BSCP was a much-needed group that helped to fight for the rights of Black men in the workplace. Canadians such as Stanley G. Grizzell, Donald W. Moore, and Harry Gary, who were porters early in their careers, helped in the fight for equality and better working conditions and pay for porters. With plaques commemorating and honoring the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in downtown Calgary and at Windsor Station in Montreal, the profound impact that this group made and what they were able to accomplish is forever cemented in Canadian history. And I think that, certainly within the United States, porters were super, super, super important in helping to develop what became the Black middle class. And I think that, just as that whole railway tradition from the US migrated up to Canada with the whole sleeping car porter, this whole idea of having Black men work on trains, I think that, that kind of empowerment also came up here as well. Although there were also so many other movements, and there's so much other different kind of work happening up here. I don't think that really answers your question, but it's me taking a stab.
No, I think it does. And I think there was a trickle effect. And to clarify for the folks who are wondering what those unions were, basically it was the Black sleeping car porters in Canada and the United States, which created the two unions, the Order of Sleeping Car Porters and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters.
That's right.
And so I think that's important to kind of highlight some of the things that were then brought into place after the many complaints and the exhaustion and just the labor, right? And you see that written all over the book. And I think you just did such a great job of encapsulating the tiredness and the undervaluedness that Black men were experiencing. So I really appreciated that. Another question that we had from the audience is that, what do we think about what's going on in Alberta now? You said it makes you sad to think about Baxter's future. Why is that?
Because he would have had to stay in the closet, and because there was such a threat of violence and even death by coming out, as we call it now. He would have had to stay hidden and would have lived in shame, and that is hugely tragic for me. I think what's happening in Alberta now with Danielle Smith's announcement around transgender youth and gender and sexuality is appalling, 100% appalling and misleading, and it's a bunch of BS. And I think, honestly, it's just, it's this kind of American Republican strategy of let's concentrate on this completely tiny group of vulnerable people so we can distract from the actual problems of, unhoused people, rising, rates in terms of rental and affordability of homes, of opioid addiction, of, so many other things that actually require attention. And instead we're focusing in on this. And some of what Smith said about, gender affirming surgeries and the whole, minors will be banned from having gender affirming surgeries. That doesn't happen in Canada anyway. It doesn't happen in Canada. Like, it's very rare for gender affirming surgeries to happen to anybody, to be approved for that before the age of 18. So why is that included in there in the first place? I think it's just her being, it's her just trying to stir up shit, frankly. I think the other thing too, where she's talked about this opting in, where parents have to opt in their children in order to learn about gender identity, sexual orientation, or sexuality, is ridiculous. It's 1950s. I don't even understand it, because basically what she's also saying is that you can't ever use the word condom in a classroom, unless you get permission from parents. So that means that it's not just the queer kids, the LGBTQ2S kids who are going to be screwed over by this. It's all kids, because they're not going to get proper education about consent, about birth control, about being a good partner, about their own bodies. This whole idea too of parental notification and the requirement of parental consent for the altering of names or pronouns for children under 15, I think is appalling and will lead to violence. There are all kinds of, basically, if parents have to give their permission, what you're going to end up doing is you're going to be outing your kid. You're going to be outing this child to parents or guardians who might be hostile to that. And so that kid might get kicked out of home and end up being, unhoused. It could lead to, violence in the home. It could lead to worse than violence in the home. So it's completely misguided. It's so beside the point. When she got in, I did not vote for her. And when she got in, I thought, okay, this is terrible. But the one good thing about her is that she seems to want to leave the queers alone. People like me, she wants to leave us alone and let us live our lives. She seems to be pro-choice. But now it's like, that was a lie. That was to get in. And so I am absolutely appalled. And I am without words. I have a lot of words, but at the same time, I'm like, I can't believe this is happening. And I work so hard living in Alberta, being Alberta born and raised, to defend this province from people, accusing us of living in a backwards place. But we live in Florida now, you know, it's really bothers me. I'm super, super, super angry, and I don't know. And all I can do is write my little books, I guess, and write letters and get angry and go to protests. I don't know what else I can do, you know?
Well, I think the representation that you're aiming to provide in books like this is super important. And you talked about just the livelihood and erasure right in the beginning, right? We cannot see erasure, and I'm appalled just as you are. And I think there is a lot of misguidedness there. But I think the work that you're doing to make sure, even though, you know, you had no idea who Baxter would become or what that porter would become, I think the decision to make this person queer and to show that history, that Black Canadian history of being a porter, was so integral and important to continue to shift the narratives around queer people, and to not erase them and to make them a part of history and a part of our futures. And so I think that's wonderful. And you said a lot about, you know, the lack of safety that comes with being outed. And, you know, in the book, the photo Baxter found in the bathroom was such a compelling metaphor for being outed. And I think we all wondered about, you know, his safety in that moment. Can you tell us more about the intentions with that photo, and how that maybe pertains to, you know, queer safety and making sure that queer folks are liberated, and also feel like they can share who they are when it feels safe and good for them?
Yeah. So the photo in the book is, how can I talk about this? So the photo in the book, on one hand, is considered pornography, um, and erotica for the time. And there was, you know, there was the kind of, there was that underground movement of so-called French postcards, which were basically pictures of people in various states of undress and, you know, having romantic and sexual liaisons. And for Baxter, when he sees that postcard, he knows that he should get rid of it. He absolutely knows he should get rid of it, because if it's caught on him, he will get fired for it. But, you know, and I think this is something fundamental that has to be understood about LGBTQ people, to us people, is that we have always been here. We will always be here. And no matter how oppressive a culture might be, we are always there, and we will always find ways to be together. You know, I think of, you know, just my own, I'm not from the 1920s, I'm not from the 1950s, but I did come out in the, you know, I started thinking about, or seriously considering, my sexuality in the late 80s or early 1990s. And it was not a safe time to do that. I mean, pride parades, they weren't parades at that point, they were marches. People had paper bags on their heads so that they wouldn't be recognized. But somehow, you know, there is that part of you that you cannot deny. And if you do, you will get in trouble. You will, you know, before I came out, when I was just wrestling with my own sexual identity, I was a deeply, deeply unhappy person. And I don't think I was a particularly kind person either. And it wasn't until I was able to come to terms with who I was and what my desires were, that I was able to actually give in a useful way. So he gets this postcard, and I think he recognizes himself in it, and so is unable to get rid of it. I think it also is, in a way, a kind of, it's an image, it's a hopeful image for him. It's sort of this aspirational image for him that, you know, there are other people in the world who feel the way he does. And I think he kind of maybe imagines himself into that photo and the kind of utopia that it represents. Now, about queer safety, and I mean, having that photograph, he's putting himself at great risk in all kinds of ways. And it's basically a ticking time bomb in his pocket. I don't know what else to say. I mean, I think just the fact that he is somebody who wants to keep his job, who wants to do the right thing, right in quotation marks, but that means but in order to be faithful to himself, he has to do the wrong thing. I think that's just, you know, testament to kind of the perseverance of queer people in general, which is that, you know, finding that strength inside, and getting strength from people outside, you know, who are willing to be visible in that way. Yeah.
Absolutely. Visibility, I think, is so important in the book itself, not only in what you're saying around this idea of hope and this photo being representation, but also just being the overall theme of visibility, visibility for Blackness, visibility for queerness, visibility for also masculinity, and what masculinity can look like for different people, because that's a whole other beautiful conversation that, you know, I wonder was intentional or not to have. Which brings me to my final question. You know, what was your hope that you wanted to shift in your readers?
What was my hope? So what did I want to shift in my readers?
Or what were you hoping to shift? Sorry.
What was I hoping to shift in my readers? You know, I think I'll just confess. I'm just writing this down so I can think about it. I will confess that when I write a book, I don't think about readers at all. Because if I did, I wouldn't write anything. I would be too scared, because they're, you know, not everybody's going to love your work, and that's okay. That's totally okay. But I was thinking very much about what Toni Morrison said, and this is just sort of my guiding light, where she once said, you know, if you cannot find the book you want to read, then you must write it. And what I wanted to see was the story of a queer man, a Black queer man in Canada, living his life and falling in love and having a happy ending. And I think what, you know, now that the book is out in the world, and maybe when I think about, you know, what I hope has shifted in readers is that stories about Black people, stories about queer people, stories about Black queer people don't have to be tragedies, that there are happy endings, that there is Black joy, that there's queer joy. And we, you know, and there are too many narratives out there that are about Black people or about queer people that have to do with pain and trauma. And I don't want that. I wanted to see a different kind of story. So I hope that, you know, for people who are maybe a bit resistant, or who perhaps have some biases towards queer people or Black people, that maybe, you know, I think the power of fiction is that you can actually get into somebody's head and see the world from somebody else's perspective and walk in their shoes for a while to see what it's like. And I mean, I think for me, certainly as a book reader, you know, books are transformational. You know, just being able to read from somebody else's perspective and get their point of view has educated me in all kinds of ways. And I don't mean like within school or university, just picking up a novel about somebody else's experience. So I hope that this book, you know, leads to just more compassion and love and joy and acceptance. You know, I hope that, you know, at the very least, I hope that people read this book as a romance with a happy ending, and that, you know, that adds something. I also am a big believer in just plain old entertainment. You know, I think art should entertain and educate, and part of the entertainment is, you know, I hope that I think it was a writer who once said, you know, his hope for the work he did, you know, as a writer. So he hoped that, you know, a reader got as much enjoyment out of reading one of his books as they would have if they had spent the same amount of money on a case of beer, you know, which is just having this moment of being able to lie back and be transported. So that's a big mushy answer. I think it's because I have very mushy feelings around all of this. You know, it's just that I have so much faith in fiction and in art to help move things forward. I think of books like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is problematic in all kinds of ways, but helped with the abolitionist movement. I think of books like Frankenstein that tell the future. I think of the work of, Zora Neale Hurston. And I think of the work of James Baldwin and, these writers who wrote about Black queer experience. And, we're all human, and we all experience joy, and we all experience pain, and let's just be fair, be equal about it. Let's have compassion for our fellow human beings. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think we all love mushy, right? That's why we're here. Book club can be seen as a mushy thing, but I think that's the point, to reimagine, to rebuild and redefine what collective liberation looks like, what visibility looks like. I love how much you touched on the importance of a happy ending and making sure that we get to rewrite our future and we get to rewrite our narrative, and making sure that's filled with softness, that's filled with care and possibility. And I love that you're doing that work, and I love that you're offering that over to us. I know you said that you don't think of the readers in mind that much, but just know the readers are pleased.
Oh, good. I'm very, very, very happy. I very much appreciate readers. It's just in the writing process, I can't think about it too much because there's too much good reads going on, and that's a scary place to be.
Yes, Reads has a lot of things, but just know that we appreciate your work. We appreciate this book. We appreciate you being here. That was my final question. Thank you so much, Suzette, for joining book club, our first book club back for the year. It was such a pleasure. We're so grateful to everyone who joined this conversation. I know that we didn't get to every question, but thank you so much for being so engaging and having these questions and joining us for this past hour and a half. Don't leave just yet. We're still going to do the giveaway. I just have a few announcements to give around some petitions on our Black History Month event that I'd love to share with you all. But again, Suzette, I just want to take this moment of gratitude. Thank you for taking the time to be here with us. Thank you for sharing your novel with us. And thank you for, diving us a little into your brain and kind of the inspirations of the book and Porter's. We are so grateful. And so to the audience, I have some stuff for you. It's currently Black History Month and Black Futures Month, and we'd like to encourage everyone to partake in our action plan supporting the Black Action lawsuit. The Black class action is seeking compensation for discrimination and implementation of a justice and equity promotional plan for the hiring and promotion of Black employees, and the implementation of a mental health fund to support people dealing with the devastating effects of discrimination. You could find more in the link in the chat box. Super important petition. I think it's important that we all engage and, mobilize in this time. Reading is important, and I'm so glad that we're here, but also remember that Amnesty's book club is not just reading, but also acting on the things that we're hearing, acting on the things that we're seeing. Super important. We've listed a bunch of links here for us to provide Black mental health support, more about our book club, learning more to take action, how to become a book club partner. You could find some more information on myself, and also the closed caption link if you'd like to review it later. So now we go to the contest, where me and Suzette will pick a few lucky folks in the audience to win a signed copy of the book. Suzette, I think how we'll do this is maybe we'll pick 5 random folks each.
Okay.
How does that feel?
Sure.
Okay, awesome. So I'm gonna look at the participants. Do you want to start first, or should I?
What do I do? I just click on participants?
Yeah, so we're just gonna go to participants, and you're gonna choose you're gonna go to attendees and just choose 5 random people. I can go first, as you probably get it navigated onto your screen.
Sure. Okay.
I'm going to start with Clara Salamanca. Congratulations, you're our first prize winner. Clara Salamanca. Our second prize winner is Donna Morse. Donna Morse, well, there's a lot of Donnas, but it's Donna with an M, so Donna Morse. Donna's a very popular name today because there's 10 Donnas in the space currently. Our third winner, we have Hilda Voth. Hilda Voth, congratulations. Then we also have, I'm gonna go to K, someone with a K. Let's go to Ken Sanderson. Ken Sanderson, congratulations. And then my final pick before I pass it on to Suzette, I'm going to pick Sinclair Harris. Sinclair Harris, congratulations. Thank you for joining us today. I'll pass it over to Suzette to pick her 5 winners.
Okay, so I'm just going to scramble it with my thumb and I'm going to close my eyes and then I'm just going to stick my finger and I've got Christina Gray. And then for the next one, just let me close my eyes here. I've got Yao Zhang, Z-H-A-N-G. And then I've got Anne-Marie Kwan. And I think there's one more, I forget. Nasrullah, Nasrullah.
Congratulations.
Is that the 5?
I believe that's 5.
Okay.
Awesome. Congratulations. You'll all be contacted from an Amnesty member to receive your signed copy of the book. I also want to remind folks that the petitions to call on Alberta to backtrack on disturbing plans to restrict the rights of queer folks in Alberta are also linked in the chat if you'd like to sign that petition as well and mobilize with us. Again, thank you so much for being here. And on a final note, the next book of Amnesty Book Club is The Yellow Face by R.F. Kuang, a satire novel exploring questions of diversity, race, cultural appropriation, and complexities of social media. You can access further events by Amnesty's Book Club through the link also linked in the chat. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Suzette. It was such a pleasure. I hope to see you all at the next book club. Enjoy your weekend.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure and an honor.
I'll see you in Alberta, maybe.
I hope so. I hope so.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.